Hello, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to Psychic Talk. I'm your host, Priscilla Gendron, and welcome to another fascinating journey into the lives of the amazing spiritual beings that walk this planet. So it also gives me sort of great pleasure to introduce my next guest who has graced our presence and has come through from other special friends that I'm connected to, and it's just my great honor to introduce him. His name is Louis Virieblanche. He's from America, and he's told me to introduce him as a Cherokee Lumbee Chococó. I think I got that right. Blackfoot, Afro-French Creole, Gumbo Yaya guy. And he's an artist, musician, and a poet. And he's going to take us through the journey of his spiritual path that he's followed through life. Welcome, Louis.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. In terms of gracing one another's presence, how blessed can it be?
It's amazing having you here. So, for me, I am a person that loves to know where people are from and the journey that they take. And a lot of the things that I do on Psychic Talk is to find out where we're coming from, our beginnings of how we started in this world and where we've got to this point to us on our spiritual journey and just on our life journey. So I'm going to leave the floor up to you because the best person to talk about your journey is you.
Okay. Well, I'm graced with heroic humility to think that, although it's not true, even as I try to say that, we all have something to share with one another that, who knows, will bring forth what ancient futuristic inner knowingness. I have this vision of like, we create a fire and we're sitting around the fire and we're telling, they don't necessarily have to be ghost stories, but we're telling stories. And your story might resonate with me in a certain way, and someone else's story might resonate, in another way. And I have a show I call Conversations with Elders. And I ask the people that come on my program to share their trinity of inspiration. Because when we're sitting around this fire, as people are gathered on the planet, we all have something to share. And I thought, well, what if we sifted through all that we've ever experienced so far in life and said, these are the three most important things that life has taught me. So I start my story by saying that, but I will gladly go through the chronological addendum of how I experienced the unfolding of my, what I will call God self-remembrance. My parents were beautiful, beautiful people. My mother had a Cherokee. The Cherokee energy comes from my mother's side of the family, and the Blackfoot energy comes from my mother's side of the family. The Choctaw and the Afro-French Creole comes from my father's side of the family. And I was really blessed and lucky to have my soul choose them to be my parents because they nurtured me in such a way. I mean, I'm so thankful. But let's just go back to my parents met, fell in love, and on 2 or 3 occasions, my mother had miscarriages. And when I came along, when she was pregnant with me, you might say there was a great yearning and anticipation for her pregnancy to go full term and to have the child that I came out to be. So I have a memory of being a child in diapers in my crib. And these beings came and stood around my crib, and they put a device on the edge of my crib, and we were telepathically communicating. And what's interesting is, you know, I'm a baby in diapers, and I've remembered this for a long time. And then just recently, just last week, through the blessings of our beloved Suki, I shared that memory, and she put some, you might say, meaning to what that was all about. Now, I had the sense that, you know, was this a dream, or did this really happen, you know? But I accepted it as being valid and real, and you might say, grew from that point as a little child. And you know, my mother is my parents are very light-skinned with beautiful hair, and they didn't really fit. From certain perspectives, they didn't fit into the framework of how people think of people of color. And I had that issue as I was growing up, because people were always asking me, like, what are you? And I was asked so often, by the time I was 7 or 8, I started saying, I'm a man of the universe. And I had an interesting moment, because my name is Louis Virieblanche. But for a while in my early years, I thought my middle name was Victor. And I saw my birth certificate one day, and I saw my middle name is Virie, V-I-R-I-E. And so I asked my mom, I said, my name isn't Louis Victor, my name is Louis Virie. She goes, yeah, that's true. She said, well, I didn't think I could pronounce that middle name well, so I called you Victor. So, you know, I'm going to jump forward in time. When I was about in my early teens, pre-teens, I lived in France. My father was in the military, so we moved a lot. And when I went to France, I was able to hear, and thankfully you pronounced my name correctly as well, Louis Virieblanche, to have a name and to not know what it is completely or truthfully, and then to never really, you know, hear it the way it's meant to be enunciated, was an interesting journey in and of itself. But here I am telling people I'm a man of the universe, and I discover that my name, my real name, and I was born in North Carolina, in what they call, in a place called Fort Bragg, North Carolina. My father, when World War II happened, my father was 6'6". He was a very tall guy.
Wow.
And because he was so tall, the friends that he hung out with as a child were older than him usually. So when World War II happened, my father's friends went off to war. And he wanted to do his part. He really wanted to be a part of that incomparable worldwide event, you know, with Hitler and the Nazis doing what they were doing to the world. My father forged my grandfather's name to get in the army at the age of 15.
Wow.
He was actually too young to be in the military, but he got in. And he was in a cavalry unit. Back then, the military had horses and mules. They had animals. That it wasn't all trucks and jeeps and drones, you know. So they had animals, and the army was segregated. My father was a person of color, so the Caucasian soldiers were separated from the people of color. And I remember my father, he was initially in the Buffalo Soldier units, because the Buffalo Soldiers, there's the 10th Cavalry, the 12th Cavalry, the 25th and 26th Cavalry units. And he was a Buffalo Soldier when he first joined the military. But then he became a paratrooper. And there's an interesting tie-in with the Buffalo Soldier energy. And I'll jump around because right now I'm in my early years. You know, I'm not even a teenager, but later on in my life, in the mid 1970s, actually in 1973, 30 years after my father joined the Army in 1943, he retired. And as I mentioned earlier, we had been living in France. Well, after we left France, we moved to southern Arizona near the Mexican border. So as I said earlier, I had this experience of living in France. We didn't live on the military base. We lived in a little French village. So the kids I played with were French, but yet I went to a US high school in Poitiers, France, Poitiers. And, we left France and I ended up in Arizona. And when we first got to Arizona, I was so enamored with horseback riding that I would rent horses Saturday and Sunday all day long because it was very cheap. It was almost like a $1 an hour to rent a horse. So I rented a horse and I was riding through these mountains called the Huachuca Mountains, which is also called, they're called Thunder Mountain. But this is the land of Geronimo and Cochise. And interestingly enough, that fort is called Fort Huachuca. And in the 1800s, it was established in order to contain Cochise and Geronimo. And now we were talking, I've come there, it's the late 60s. Well, actually, I came there in 1966. And it happened to be, Fort Huachuca happened to be the home of the Buffalo Soldier because the 10th Cavalry, the 12th Cavalry, the 25th and 26th Cavalry units were all stationed there. And I'm riding horses through these Huachuca Mountains and they border Mexico and Arizona. And I'm just having this relationship, this communion with that land and the people. Arizona is a state that has Hopis, Navajos, Apaches, Pima Indians, Gila Indians, Yaqui Indians. There's a lot of Indian tribes that are affiliated with Arizona. So for me, I saw the blessing of having gone to France, which I have a connection with France, and then I come to Arizona and I'm meeting these Native American people. And ironically, my father had been a Buffalo Soldier. And I had had dreams in the 70s of Jamaica. Now you have to forgive me, I'm jumping through time here, but I'm weaving my way. I'll go back, but I'm picking up some of the things that were whispering to me as a child developed later on in my life. And I'm just tapping on some of those points right now. But I'm in Arizona having dreams of Jamaica. And my dreams, I was having very lucid dreams. I'll have to go into this in more detail, but I had in about a 3 or 4 month period, I was driving a Carmen Ghia, driving a lady and her daughter to see her husband in California. And we were in Arizona and I was driving this Carmen Ghia and I fell asleep at the wheel. I woke up hearing gravel and grass and I was off the road. I turned the wheel, we crossed the freeway, the car went airborne and it bounced and bounced. It landed upright, but the top of the car was completely flat. And I'm 6'3", and the lady was in the car seat next to me and her daughter was in the back. You know what a little Carmen Ghia is, a little Volkswagen. Well, during that journey of falling asleep and going airborne, I went out of my body. And I returned to my body and I elbowed the door of the car to get it open. I went around and opened the door for this lady and her daughter, and we had not a scratch on us. We were nothing was wrong. And when I went off the road and went across the freeway and went airborne, all the trucks and drivers on the road, they witnesses, they saw us doing all this. And when they came to see if we were okay. They couldn't, no one could believe that we weren't hurt. They took us to the hospital and they checked us out and we were fine. So that was a huge moment, you might say, in my life. But in this same time frame, I had this Carmen Gia accident, out-of-body experience. And right before that, I had broken up with a girlfriend that was my first real taste of heartache. We thought we would marry, and but it wasn't meant to be, and she left. And when she left, she wrote me a postcard with the picture of a deer on one side. And when I was growing up, I am a writer and a poet, but when I was growing up, the words that would come to me would kind of whisper in my ear, and I would pay them no mind. But eventually I started noticing these words are repeating, these phrases and little snippets that keep coming back to me. So eventually I bought a journal to just take notes on what I now call these whispers of eternity. What were they saying to me? So I had a journal, and this girlfriend that I was so brokenhearted over sent me the picture of a deer, and I pasted that picture in the very first page of my journal. And I had a leather bag that I carried with me with my journal in it. So I had the girlfriend, the heartbreak with my girlfriend. I had the Carmen Gia out-of-body experience. And I moved to a new place and had 2 roommates there. And the one of my roommates was working, and I left one afternoon to pick him up from work. And when we came back to the house, there were fire trucks all around our house. And my room was no longer a room. It didn't have a ceiling or walls. It was basically, the floor of my room was full of ashes and water. And from a very, very young age, I'd been buying albums. My room was a huge room, and I had albums, maybe 100 albums in a row, like all around the perimeter of my room. And but everything in my room went up in smoke, so to speak. But I had my leather bag with my journal in it. It survived the fire. And then ironically, there was one album that survived the fire. It was out in the living room, and it was an album shaped like a stop sign by a gentleman who was very influential on my musical growth, a gentleman named Eric Burden from the band The Animals. And also he was in Eric Burden and War. But the Eric Burden Stop album was out in the living room, and I had my bag of writings in this leather bag, which survived the fire. So the next thing that's happening is I was having dreams, very lucid dreams. Like I dreamed something on Monday, and then it would happen on Tuesday. And I had dreamt of the house we moved into after the fire. And I was having dreams. Shortly thereafter, I started having these dreams of Jamaica, but they didn't quite kick in at then that same time frame. But in this first 2 or 3 months, where the heartbreak, the out-of-body experience in the Carmen Gia, now the fire, and ironically, in my room, I had gathered all my family pictures. I had gathered all the family pictures, and I was going to put them in new photo books. But what happened was they happened to be in my room when I had the fire. So literally the photographs of our family history kind of also went up in smoke. And people saw me. I mean, I had silk scarves, and I had guitars, and I had all these clothing, and I had a lot of stuff, And after the fire, people would say, "Wow, Louis, you lost all your albums and you lost all your stuff." And I said, "But no worries." I said, "Look, I've got my bag and my writings." I wasn't sad about what I had lost. I was thrilled to have what was there in my life, what had made it through the fire. And, you know, this is one of those moments in my life where I'm watching myself. I have what I call an inner eyewitness. I'm watching how I'm reacting to the situation. And I've learned a lot in my life from being attentive to that aspect of myself from another perspective. And people couldn't believe that I wasn't heartbroken over all the things I'd lost. I was just overjoyed with what I had. But one afternoon, my friends and I were sitting around and someone says, let's go to Mazatlan, let's go to Mexico. So we're in Tucson, Arizona. On the spur of the moment, we drive to Nogales, Arizona. There's a town called Nogales, Arizona, and a town called Nogales, Mexico. And we get on the train in Nogales, Mexico, and we take it down to Mazatlan. And we are on the beach every day and at night going to this restaurant. And one night, my bag is stolen. The bag that my journal was in, the bag that had survived the fire, was now stolen. And so in my mind and my heart, I'm going, wow, I lost my girlfriend. I had this out-of-body experience in this Carmen Gia. I was so happy with having my journal, and it was gone. So I went to the cathedral in Mazatlan for a few days, just searching my soul. Because I'd had in between those moments, I was having these lucid dreams of the house we moved into. And so I would go there and just meditate and contemplate and pray. And while I was in the cathedral one day, I opened my eyes and this man was standing before me, and he just reached out to shake my hand, and we shook hands, and he just walked away. And I continued my meditation and prayer. But the next day when I went in to do my meditations, when I came out of the cathedral, another man came up to me and he motioned for me to follow him. I didn't speak very much Spanish and he didn't speak any English, but he said, come. I followed him and then he kind of said, wait. And he brought my bag back to me. And I was overjoyed. I took him to the restaurant. I bought him dinner. And the bartender translated for us. And the bartender, he said, you know, when these people steal your property, they don't bring it back to you. They take what they want and they throw the rest away. He says, but you have in the first page of your journal, you've pasted a picture of a deer. And he told me something that I didn't know. He said, Mazatlan means land of the deer. And he said, they saw your journal with the deer and your writings, and they thought that they should basically bring it back to you. And there's a lot of Yaqui Indians, like the Yaquis do a sacred deer dance. And the yarn and bead paintings that I do, the Huichol Indians also honor the sacredness of the deer. So that deer in my first page of my journal, and there we are, as if by chance, in a place called Mazatlan, which means land of the deer. My bag came back to me. And in doing so, I'll show you something. During this highly pivotal time of heartbreak, out-of-body experiences, fires, lucid dreams, my bag being stolen and coming back to me, and losing all this music I'd been collecting since I was a little boy, I met a gentleman named Dr. Patrick Flanagan, who was a world-renowned pyramid researcher. But he was, interestingly enough, he was part Cherokee. And he had a laboratory in Tucson, Arizona, where I was living. And the way I saw these events, I kind of digested and discerned all these events happening. I saw that by not having all that music by other people, and then being so happy to have my writings survive the fire, and then having the writings taken away and brought back to me, it dawned on me that in this little book of writings, I had all these poems and lyrics. And I had met Dr. Flanagan, and he was kind of tapping in on these whisperings that I had about Egypt. The first band I had a band called The Flow. And on my business card for the band, I had these pyramids drawn with camels crossing the desert. And at that time, I wasn't really deeply into Egyptology, but meeting Dr. Flanagan was very profound because he was, when he was 9 or 10 years old, he had invented a guided missile detection system. He had entered the Houston Science Fair with this guided missile detection system, and he won all ages in the science fair. When he went to school that Monday, the FBI and the CIA came to the school and they said, "Young man, we have to take this device of yours. We have no idea how you created it." He said, "Well, I made that in my garage, my dad's garage." So they gave him a business card and they said, "Do you want to start work right now for us?" And he said, no, I'm making more money than my father is right now. I mean, he's like 10 years old, you know. Excuse me. At the age of 17, he was listed in Life magazine as being one of the top young scientists in America. So he's a pretty phenomenal young man. And now I meet him in this early to mid 70s. And he allowed me to use a symbol of his. This symbol is a sensor symbol. He called it a flat pyramid. It's an energy device. It's a magnetic form resonance device. But the songs on this album, the lyrics and poetry for that album was in that bag that came back to me. So the way that I looked at these events, I said, well, those records that I would play and listen to all day long, but I wasn't doing anything, going to classes, I was listening to other people's music. So it dawned on me that the bag leaving and coming back to me, I said, okay, I get it. It was saying, do something with these dream streams, what I now call dream streams of poetic consciousness. I was meant to do something with them. And it became this album. And I shared this with you in some of the writings I sent to you just recently. But on the back of this album, there's a poem called Self-Portrait. Energy follows thought. And it was from a sound poetry composition I had done called Skylight Crawl Out, Radio Magic Down to Me. And it goes, there is an energy, an essence, a love unknown to earth, a reflection of someone unseen, reaching in our direction, translating dreams into future perfection. Like some new language without past, present, or future time, for the magic of the moment, time and time again. Tracing sweet inspiration, I sleep in other beds of reality, waking rich with hidden treasure. My soul springs into songs I never knew, jumping in heart first, hypnotized by the flow, building pyramids of prayer, deep in nighttime energy. Without an image to wear, I look in empty spaces, listening to the silence, refreshing myself anew, holding on to the trance from the inside out, understanding the magic of music between us, living realities where all that is good. So in many ways, this album grew from all those moments that could be seen as trials and tribulations, all the agony and ecstasy of those experiences, all the mystery of mysteries embedded into those experiences spoke to me, and this album came along. So and these things all happen. I mean, those events, this album, I had the house that turned out to be the house where the fire happened. We had a little jam session in that house a week or two before the fire. And I had met this guitar player, and my drummer was one of my roommates. So that guitar player and the drummer, we found a bass player, and basically the band that I put together called The Flow, I was putting my poems now to use and these lyrics. And I didn't really play an instrument. I mean, I think I played one chord on guitar, but in my head, I was hearing music. I was hearing the orchestrations, and I knew what I wanted. So we were blessed that the guitar player and I, we wrote 99% of the songs were all original songs. I had the audacity to think that I would go into the studio with this band and produce a single. I'd never been to the studio, never produced a record, but I thought I could do it. And I bought studio time. I told the band we're going in the studio, because we were playing the music we were very tight, very intuitive. We knew those songs, like we could play them in our sleep. So when we went in the studio, before doing a full album, this Sun Song album, I did a little single. And I had the audacity to go to the commercial radio station, because back then there was no YouTube or internet and community radio stations. It wasn't as easy to get music on a commercial radio station unless you were signed to a label. But I took the little single to the radio station, and not long thereafter, we're riding around and we hear ourselves on the radio. And it's thrilling, you know. It's like, wow, my dreams are really blossoming into reality here. But I was having more dreams. I was dreaming of Jamaica at this time. And the band was very, very successful, and we were doing what a band should be doing. But I told the band members, I've got to leave. I've got to go to Jamaica. But before going, I sent some of my poetry, my avant-garde poetry, I sent to a lady named Patti Smith. Patti Smith and her guitar player, Lenny Kaye, formed a band called the Patti Smith Group. And in the 70s, she was a poet from like the Allen Ginsberg, East Village, New York street poets. You know, she was just this poet, but she had this wild rock and roll spirit. And she eventually was entered into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and she's kind of known as the Queen of Punk. So in April of 77, I actually sent my poetry, and the piece that I talked about, this poem I read, was in a sound poetry piece I had entitled Skylight Crawl Out, Radio Magic Down to Me. And I had this idea that I would sit in my home was now on a corner in Tucson, Arizona, of 4th Avenue and 7th Street, which was near the university, but it was like the hip college street in town. And I slept upstairs, and the band rehearsed in the basement. And I borrowed this reel-to-reel recorder. I had gone in the studio to do the single, but I had this idea that I would do this recording, and I would use sounds that I could find in my apartment. So I used tin foil, I used cellophane. I had a transistor radio, and I would use the static on the radio, and I just found objects and put it together in a piece that I called sound poetry. And I sent that to Patti Smith and Lenny Kaye. And I sent the more ethnic R&B, reggae, rock and roll things to another gentleman named Taj Mahal. He's a blues master, Taj Mahal. So I sent the poetry to Patty and Lenny, and I sent the other music to Taj Mahal. And at about the same time, they both responded to me. And Taj offered me publishing contracts. And Patty Smith and Lenny wrote me a letter, and they were doing a project called Radio Ethiopia at the time. And I got this letter, you know, snail mail, an actual letter with a stamp on it. And, you know, the post office delivered this letter, and they wrote me and said, Louis, some of the sound textures you get, we've never heard of before. And then they said, your poetry is quite intriguingly good as well. And they were like my heroes, you know, I mean, and from one sense, it was like, wow, Patty and Lenny wrote me a letter. And then Taj calls me and he offered me publishing contracts. And my band is hearing me say that I've got to leave and go to Jamaica. They thought I was crazy. They said, you know, what are you doing going? You're going to go to Jamaica? And we look at all the good things that are happening. And I said, no, I got to go. I was having these dreams of Jamaica. Jamaica at that time was, in order to vote in Jamaica, you might have to ignore gunshots near the voting station. And I was dreaming of people and places in Jamaica. And I had an incident, that corner that I was living on, 4th Avenue and 7th Street. One night, our band played a gig and we came home. You know, you play your gig until 1 in the morning and you're coming home at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I came down the street with my car full of people, and I turned around and parked in front of my place. And these 3 guys start walking down the street. And we had gone inside, and I was living in an old photography studio that had the photochemicals in one of the back rooms. One of my cats had gotten into the chemicals and had passed. So I told my friend Wayne, I said, we got to take the cat outside. So when I went to take the cat outside, I see these guys walking down the street. And I noticed that they have what looked like to me guns in their hands. So I told my friend, I said, let's go, let's get inside, let's go. And so we go inside and I turn the lights off. I've got about 6, 7, 8 people in my home. And I had these big picture windows on one side of the 7th Street side, and the 4th Avenue side of my home was big, big windows. And I had these bamboo curtains. So I could slightly see the silhouette or shadows of people if they were near my apartment. So when we went inside my apartment, these gentlemen started running towards my place. And I told everyone to be quiet. We turned the light off, and a friend of mine was on the staircase coming down from my bedroom. And I told him in the little basket in my bedroom, there was this little can of mace or pepper spray. At that time, the bars would give bands some pepper spray, like you'd get paid cash, and they'd give you these little things in case someone, you know, was going to rob you. You might defend yourself. And that's all we had. You know, we didn't have, I'm not a gun person. I didn't have any guns. But there was a guy there, his name is Neville Telcontar. And Neville was a very interesting character. He talked about strange things. He talked about space beings. In fact, he was very much into Jefferson Airplane, who later on became Jefferson Starship. But Neville talked things about the star people, and people thought he was cuckoo. And so he happened to be standing in the floor of my place. I was over here, and my friend Wayne was on the stairs, and everyone else was on a kind of cowered around when these guys kicked my door in. I had these French doors, and they kicked the door in, and there they were with guns. And my friend Neville, he had this little buck knife, like a little pocket knife. And he's standing there holding the knife, and the people are holding the guns. And it was just like this moment of moments. it turned out that earlier in the evening, these guys were bikers and they had a tattoo shop up the street. And someone had driven down the street and shot, not necessarily at them, but fired some guns. And that's when they saw us coming back at 2 in the morning. For some reason, they thought they were going to check us out to see if we had had anything to do with that thing that had happened earlier. But blessedly, they recognized, no one got shot, no one got hurt. And at that time, upstairs in my bedroom, I had that reel-to-reel that I did, Skylight Crawl Out Radio Magic Down to Me. I recorded that on that recording device. And I was writing another song called Outlaw. And the lyrics in Outlaw go, you're shooting at me, I'm an outlaw, I'm an outlaw, I'm dreaming for freedom to make love in public, I'm an outlaw. In fact, one of the lyrics in that song is like, I'm a pregnant woman who needs an abortion, I'm an outlaw. If you kill me, you kill nothing at all. And then dark of the night, my spirit's moving on. I have these lyrics, I'm in the Wild West, I'm in Arizona, which Tucson is a shoot 'em up town. I'd been living in southern Arizona, an hour and a half south of there, near the famous western town of Tombstone and Bisbee. So this motif of this outlaw, which is one of the songs on this album, I kind of finished recording that after this episode with my door being kicked in. So I'm having these dreams of Jamaica, and I go to Jamaica. But right around the same time that I was having this episode with my door being kicked in, there was a guy named Bob Marley who was living in Kingston, Jamaica on 56 Hope Road. And one of his songs was being used by one of the candidates for prime minister. Michael Manley used one of Bob Marley's songs for his campaign song. And basically at that time, the JLP and the PNP parties in Jamaica were gangs. They were rival gangs. And some of the people that didn't like Bob's song being used by the other party drove into his yard and shot and drove out. And Bob and his manager and Rita, they weren't killed, but they got wounded. So there was this outlaw moment in my life in Tucson, Arizona, and there was this outlaw moment in the life of Bob Marley that I can't say how it's connected, but I went to Jamaica while this was going on. Bob Marley left the island of Jamaica, and he didn't come back until April of 1978. And what's interesting was I went to Jamaica when Jamaica had been the third recipient of foreign aid from the United States of America. And then with all this chaos going on, Michael Manley was a social democrat. And he was bringing Cuban doctors and farmers into Jamaica to help the people. But the world of political thinking thought he was becoming a communist. And then Marley's getting shot at, and the voting in Jamaica was very hectic and very difficult. I'm going to Jamaica at a time where people were leaving Jamaica. A lot of people from Jamaica, there was a huge exodus at that time because the country was so on fire with conflict. But I go to Jamaica. I'm living on the west end of the island in this thatched hut shaped like a teepee. This dentist named Dr. Miller had left Jamaica and gone to India to do philanthropic work with people there. He had been doing the same thing in Jamaica, but the lady that eventually became the mother of my kids, I took her to Jamaica with me, and we lived in this thatched hut. Well, before we left for Jamaica, her family lived in New York, and the people I was talking to there said, you shouldn't be going to Jamaica. It's a very dangerous time. The New York Times, the Washington Post, all these articles about Jamaica weren't very positive. So the woman who became the mother of my kids, she had friends who had a home in Jamaica, and they said, you got to go over and have dinner with them. They'll tell you about Jamaica. So I'd go over to have dinner with them, and they tell me that, everybody in Jamaica walks around with a machete. They do everything with a machete. They pick their teeth, they build homes, they do everything with a machete. They say, right now, you're going to go to Jamaica and they're going to cut your head off. And, I had dinner with them. I said, well, thank you for the encouragement, but I went to Jamaica anyway. So I'm living in this thatched hut, and the beach was maybe 30 feet from our door. I'm meeting Rastafarians and people, beautiful people. And something told me that I had to go to the other side of the island, to the city of Kingston, where the studios were. So I left the mother of my kids, of my future kids, in the hut there in Negril. I go over to Kingston. And there was a studio in Kingston called Harry J. Studios. And at that time, all the very classic, what would become the classic albums, like Bob Marley's Catch a Fire album, the Rastaman Vibration album, anyone that was anyone in Jamaican music was recording at Harry J's at that time. So I go to Kingston, I'm in taxis and I'm asking them to take me places. And they say, no, man, we don't go there, man. You get out here and you walk. Because there were places that even Jamaican people didn't want to go because it was just very volatile. So I find my way to Harry J. Studio, and I've got this little cassette of the songs that I had recorded in the desert of Southern Arizona. One of them was Outlaw. The other one was Sun Song, which was the title of this album. And I let the engineer there named Sylvan Morris hear my music. And he said, picture music, man. This is picture music. And I didn't know exactly what he meant, but I think he was saying my lyrics were very graphic and they painted pictures. So that was his way of saying, picture music, man, picture music. And he said, listen, Harry J isn't here. He goes, but I'm going to tell him about you. And I said, cool, So I go back to the thatched hut on the west side of the island. I get a letter from my mother. She says, my father's going in the hospital. So we leave Jamaica and go back to Southern Arizona. When I get there, it turns out my mother was so worried about me being in Jamaica that my father wasn't really going into the hospital for an emergency. He was going in for a regular checkup. So I fly back to Arizona, and thankfully my father's not ill. And while I'm there, I get asked to do a poetry reading for the commemoration of a Buffalo Soldier statue, which was being built there at the fort where my father had retired from. Because as I said earlier, the 10th, 12th, 25th, and 26th Cavalry units were all stationed at Fort Huachuca. And because of that, they were doing a commemoration of a statue there. I did a poetry reading for the statue, the Buffalo Soldier statue. And then I get a call from Jamaica a few days later. And this guy says, hey, it's Harry J, man. I'm in Kingston. You come back, I will help you to record your music. Sylvan told me about you. So Sylvan had told him about my picture music. And here is Harry J, the studio owners, telling me to come back. And so I go back. And it's April of 1978. And Bob Marley, who had left the island after getting shot at, was returning to the island for what became this world-renowned concert called the One Love Concert. So I'm hanging at Harry's house every day and going to the studio, and he's going to help me record my music. And one day I leave the studio, nothing was really going on. I go around the corner to get a patty and some soursop juice, and I come back and there's cars everywhere and all this commotion. And I walk through the crowded people in the studio, and the lights on over the studio door, but I don't pay any attention to that. When the red light's on, that means there's a recording in session. But I open the door and I go in, and there's Bob Marley, and there's this band, and there's this guy named King Sporty, whose real name is Noel Williams. And guess what they're doing? They're recording a song called Buffalo Soldier. And I'm squatting down near the wall, and I'm hearing these songs, the song they're doing, and King Sporty had brought these musicians from Miami to record with Bob. and they were working on this song called Buffalo Soldier. In my mind, I'm going, wow, I just came from Southern Arizona, the home of the Buffalo Soldier. My father was a Buffalo Soldier. So there was a guy in the studio named Lee Scratch Perry who just became a world famous engineer, producer, because he kind of helped Bob to define his sound. Lee Scratch Perry is highly respected in the world of Jamaican music. And, you know, there was a big pot of rice and beans we ate that night, but there I was following my dreams, and I'm seeing the places I had lucidly had dreams about, and I'm meeting these people. And then Harry J tells me, man, you're going to record it. And 2 days from now, I'm getting you the musicians. We're going to do your songs. So he brought me Ian Miller, Towter Harvey, and Calvin Rashid McKenzie from the band Inner Circle. And actually, Towter Harvey was a member of the Wailers. So I had been doing my little recordings in Arizona with my band, but there I was in Jamaica, and Harry J is bringing these musicians who most of the world didn't know what reggae was at that time. It was like, was that ragu? What kind of music is this? You know, reggae wasn't a household word at that time. But my first professional recording session, I do Outlaw, I do Sun Song, and it was just a phenomenal moment. I had been dreaming of these places and people in Jamaica. And then I'll skip ahead a little bit. 3 years later, right before Bob passed, they released that song, Buffalo Soldier. They put it out on an album. But I was also in Jamaica in 1981 when Bob passed. And I'm staying at this hotel called the Sandhurst. And I'm downstairs by the pool, and a few doors down from me is a lady named Lucy. And she had one of Bob Marley's legitimate children, Julian Marley. And Julian was coming to my room every day, and he was singing. I wanted to sing Bob Daddy songs. Bob was his father, and he called him Bob Daddy songs. In fact, I've got a cassette here of that time. Julian was coming to my room and singing Bob's songs and hanging out with me. And I had a dream of this hotel, the Sandhurst. In Arizona, these lucid dreams I've been having of Jamaica and all these tie-ins with the Buffalo Soldier statue in Arizona and Bob recording the song. I mean, life is just weaving this matrix for me. And just as we speak, just 2 weeks ago, I did some tracks with Julian Marley's percussionist, a guy named Speedy. And there's other moments where for some reason, Jamaica has been calling to me throughout, started in the 70s, and here we are in 2024. There's a lot more to say about that. But I'll go back now to my little childhood time frame. And I'm in North Carolina. My dad was a soldier. You know, he had now become a paratrooper, and he bought a new car every couple of years. My dad was fond of Buicks, so he bought Buicks. And I'm in the Buick. I remember this vividly. Back then, cars didn't have seat belts. The dashboards were all metal, and no one thought about you having an accident, and there was no, you know, there were no pillows coming out to cushion you from crashing into the car. And I had a moment in one of those Buicks where my mother did a quick stop, and I hit my head on the windshield and cracked it. And the doctor told my mother that I was so young that my brain hadn't really formed. And thankfully, it knocked some sense into me, I suppose. It didn't hurt me. But I'm riding in a Buick one day, and I hear this voice on the radio. And it just struck me, and it was Harry Belafonte. And of course, I didn't know then as a child, but Harry Belafonte is from Jamaica. In fact, Harry Belafonte probably did more. He's kind of a, even though he's world renowned, he's an unsung hero when it comes to, as a Jamaican person of color, he was in a movie in the 50s dating a Caucasian woman, which was like groundbreaking stuff. In fact, Harry Belafonte called up Sidney Poitier in the 60s and said, we've got to go to Birmingham, Alabama. And Martin Luther King was getting ready to have the very famous walk because there was a garbage strike going on. Like the people of color, the black garbage men were not getting treated fairly. And Martin Luther King was going down there to do a peaceful demonstration in support of the workers. The next day after that march, Martin Luther King got assassinated. But meanwhile, Harry Belafonte got a call from Martin Luther King and said, you know, you've been marching with us here and doing things, and we need some help from you. We need money to take care of the logistics of this march. But back then, a person of color couldn't get any money wired to them through Western Union and live. If you received money in Western Union, they might tell you it got lost. And if they did give it to you, by the time you walked out on the street, you'd probably be knocked over the head and your money would be stolen. So when Martin Luther King called Harry Belafonte and said, we need money to back this march, but we can't have it sent through the normal channels, will you help us? So Harry called up his good friend, Sidney Poitier, and he said, will you go with me? We got to go down to Alabama. And Sidney didn't know exactly what they were doing, but he said, sure, I'll go with you. So the story goes that they had a suitcase full of money. These two people of color, two guys that would eventually be world-renowned actors and musicians and social activists, they're cruising down to Alabama with this money so that they could pull off this march. And beloved, you know, Harry passed away maybe a year ago. I think he lived to be in his 90s. But I heard something that he said about his experiences with all this activism, how as an actor of color, him breaking that color barrier by being depicted in a movie having a romantic relationship with a Caucasian woman. And then Deo and all the songs he sang, I mean, it was phenomenal. He was like reaching the world beyond anything that anyone had thought of in the 1950s. But one of the things he said in a documentary I saw right before he passed, he said, because people said, what was it like being involved in all that activity, this social activism that you were a part of? He goes, the best is yet to come, but the worst is yet to be revealed. And it stuck with me, you know. I remember, like, I was at I met this actor who happened to be a person of color actor, and we were talking and we just met, and I asked him if he had heard the statement that Harry Belafonte had made, because this gentleman had made a movie about a young Black boy being adopted by two women, Caucasian women. And their motif was to show, their modus operandi was to show that this Black child couldn't really make it in the world, wouldn't be capable of learning things and doing what other human beings do. But this gentleman I was talking to had made this movie about the true story of this boy's life. And of course, he went on to be, he earned an education, he became a credible person. But that gentleman, I remember saying, you know, Harry Belafonte made a statement that stuck with me. And it is that the best is yet to come and the worst is yet to be revealed. So I'm in my parents' 50-something Buick, and I hear Harry Belafonte's voice on the radio, and it spoke to me in ways that I didn't know until later. But as I'm growing up, I'm drawing. I had some artistic inspiration coming to me, and I was blessed by my parents having these gatherings at our home where there were Europeans and Asians and Africans, and like my father loved to fish and to hunt. And because he was in the military and because he was, my parents didn't think in very strict racial terms. They had a lot of friends from all parts of the world. And many times there were potlucks. So all this food from those cultures was there. So one of the things I'm very thankful in having the parents that I had was they brought me into a world of diversity. But my father also had this thing where he was born in a town called Macomb, Mississippi, which is an hour from New Orleans. And Macomb, Mississippi happens to be the home of Bo Diddley. That bump, 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 bump. That's a clave rhythm. But it's originally a Yoruban rhythm from West Africa. So the slaves, as they were transported from Africa and swept around the world and ended up in the Gulf of Mexico, they would sometimes be dropped off on the east coast of Mexico, and then they'd make their way up the Gulf of Mexico and end up in a town called New Orleans. And at that time, New Orleans was like this international port where all these people from the melting pot of the world were being brought into this place called New Orleans. The slaves that were brought there were mingling with the Native Americans that lived there and created a whole new culture, like the Mardi Gras culture, where the Black African West, you might say the relatives of the original West African slaves that ended up in New Orleans remembered the drumming and the dancing of their homeland, combined that with the Native American energy that was in the New Orleans area. And they say that America's true first art form is jazz, because it combines European melody with African rhythms. And New Orleans was almost like a planet unto itself. There was all this intermingling of cultures. Even the music that New Orleans was eventually known for was like this combination of diverse elements. And my father's side of the family was from there, so I was intrigued by that growing up. But when I was a young child, I was always going. We would go there to visit my grandfather. My mother's side of the family was from North Carolina. And my dad had this thing. He goes, I'm going to take you to 5-star restaurants and 5-star hotels, but I'm also going to show you the backwoods where the honky tonks and where the real soul people are doing their thing, you know. And like my cousins, my mother had a situation in her life. She had a sister and 2 brothers, and her parents divorced. The father took a boy and a girl, and her mother took a boy and a girl. So my aunt and uncle that went to with my Cherokee grandmother were in North Carolina in a different world than I was living in. Because my father and my mother worked for the civil service. She worked 30 years and never took a day off never was sick. My father was 30 years in the military, and they were earning money and living a different life than my mother's sister. My mother's sister was living in these shotgun shacks in the middle of tobacco fields and cornfields and cotton fields. And I think my aunt had 4 or 5 kids, my cousins. They barely ever wore shoes. They lived in basically and slept in one room. And I was talking to my cousin, Joyce Ann, about this recently. She said when we'd come there, it was like I was coming from outer space. I was so different. And I was dressed, I would be wearing little suits and ties and shoes. and they were wearing shorts and barefoot, you know. And my dad would take me to these moonshine places out in the middle of the woods. And my cousin's father, unfortunately, was a drinking man. I mean, he was a sharecropper. He was working for what had been an ex-plantation owner with a huge family living and cooking on a wood stove. And my cousins just weren't living the life that I was living. But we'd come down and have these visits, and eventually my father and my aunt's husband would grab all us kids and take us to the grocery store, which sometimes is a combination bar, and then we'd gravitate over to the moonshine place out in the middle of the woods. And so I was hearing things down there, though. The jukeboxes in those little honky-tonks, they were playing this music. They were playing like the music of Bo Diddley and B.B. King. And I remember hearing Aaron Neville tell it like it is. I mean, the jukebox was like a god or a goddess. I mean, I'm a little child and I'm like really enamored with what I was hearing and feeling coming out of that music, you know. And later on in life, I realized that all these English groups, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Animals, they were hearing that music because the merchant seamen and sailors that went from South America and Africa would go through towns like New Orleans, and they'd come back home with this music, these albums. And so the English people, musicians that became the English invasion, they were hearing the culture that I was being raised in with my father and mother, and then these international gatherings that were happening at my family's home, people just playing good music, good food, and good people. It's like just, we heard music and there was food and camaraderie. And then I you know, later on, this revolution is happening, you know, the 60s. And then before that, Elvis was down in Memphis, going to the blackest part of town, listening to all that Afrocentric culture, taking it into himself and putting it out in a way that no one had thought could be done. And at that time, there were race records. You couldn't be a person of color and be played on the same radio station as Caucasian musicians. But Elvis sounded Black, but happened to be a Caucasian guy. But he was going on Beale Street in Memphis, he was taking in the spirit and culture of the people. And that process was big in my life. I was in love with Elvis. Before I was very highly influenced by Eric Burdon from the Animals, because they were doing the songs of Bo Diddley and Jimmy Reed and Chuck Berry, and they were doing, you know, Billie Holiday and Louis Armstrong, and all that that melting pot, that gumbo of diverse musical styles was becoming this cultural revolution. And in my little mind, I'm hearing Barry Belafonte singing, and I'm listening to all the stuff my parents were doing, playing at their parties. My dad loved jazz, and he also loved country music, which is an interesting combination of musics. And my mother loved the Sam Cookes and the Ray Charleses and the Johnny Mathises, and there was a guy named Johnny Ace. I mean, to me, I mean, it's like something that again, I give thanks for my parents having this unknowing influence on how I was seeing the world and why I was calling myself a man of the universe. And it affected me and still has a huge effect on me. Very thankful for it. And even as we speak now, you know, the hip hop culture, the world of divergent, the world of diversity in a strange way increases our yearning for unity and also displays it in the sense that we have now what's known as blue-eyed soul singers, people that whose skin color might be a different complexion, but when it gets down to the creative spirit of their soul and the way they marry their spirit with the song and reach out to the world, you know, my father and my mother were very instrumental in allowing me to have my soul deeply seasoned by all that kind of activity. And then these lucid dreams, these out-of-body experiences, these connections with Bob Marley. That was one of the things that struck me about Jamaica, because Jamaica, of course, was colonized by England, but there's East Indians there, there's Chinese people there, there's African people there. And they have a saying like out of one people out of many. Like I saw people like myself in Jamaica, these people that weren't quite definable by racial categories. There's these Black people that sound English, you know, and these Chinese people with dreadlocks. You know, there was just so much. It was like I fell in love with the culture of Jamaica. I've always wanted to take my parents there because I knew they'd love it, because the way they raised me and the world that we traveled in. My father was in the military, so we lived in a lot of different places. And as I said, he was very adamant on showing me life on both sides of the track. You know, over here, you've got the honky tonks, and over here, you've got the five-star hotel. But you notice that those guys playing music in the five-star hotel, they came from the honky tonks, you know. And there's some interesting things like Frank Sinatra, even when Nat King Cole played Las Vegas, he was not allowed to stay in the hotels that Frank Sinatra was staying in. And Frank called up some of those hotels and said, listen, this guy is a beautiful artist, and you don't give him a room where he wants to stay, I'm not going to be playing your casinos anymore. And people like Harry Belafonte, you know, tearing these walls down and these glass ceilings and just doing, through the power of music and the power of creative inspiration, yeah, people following and listening to their hearts. You know, this has been, thankfully I've done that in my life, and I look at my life as being a journey of cosmic stepping stones and invisible breadcrumbs.
That's amazing. Louis, you have had me mesmerized, and I'm just looking at the time, and we and I just realized I've just been so enthralled by your journey so far. And it's just been such a wonderful inspiration to hear of your beginnings in your musical journey. And I know that there is just so much more to unwrap in terms of you and your amazing abilities and talents. So I'd love to have you back on Psychic Talk again for maybe a part 2 or part 3 or maybe a part 7 maybe. Because there's just so much to unwrap in your amazing journey that you're taking. I really would like to thank you so much for sharing your journey with me. And everything you've said so far has just resonated with me in terms of the music culture, and everything just resonated with me in the sense of that is how I grew up. That's the kinds of things that I listened to. And I'm in South Africa. So it felt as if it was completely, you know, global in its in essence, in a sense. Man of the universe for sure.
Wow. Well, you know, I am so thankful. I'm humbled by the fact that my story has something to say. I do believe in, as I said earlier, the tradition of storytelling, because without stories, there are aspects of culture that would be lost.
Exactly.
Native American world right now, elders telling stories is key to what we call healing the sacred hoop.
Mm.
So I am honored and privileged and thankful for you to allow me to share this story. But I have to say
No, thank
that
you.
the fire, a bag stolen and being brought back to me, the universe, little by little, that unseen aspect of creation that we might give all kinds of names to, whether it's Krishna, Buddha, God, Muhammad, or just the quantum physics of resonance in this
Yes,
vibrational field of eternal here and nowness. When that
exactly.
quiet stillness speaks to us and we listen, and we can't help but see that there's a rhyme and a reason to it that's needs to be honored.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's such beautiful words. I want to thank you so much for joining me today on Psychic Talk. And please know that this is only part one of more to come from this incredible man and his journey. So, Louis, thank you very much for joining us. And we'll chat with you soon. Thank you.
Blessings. Thank you.